DJ referred to him as his brother, even though they're not actually related.
They grew up together in West Hartford, went to Hall High School.
You find one, you find the other. I observed a tan Honda Accord parked, the doors open.
You could see blood where their victims were in the front seats when they were shot.
He never saw the shooter. He claims that he didn't know who shot them.
Alarm bells are going off in their head. This might be a retaliation.
There was one young man who really had this expectation of himself to do what was right and avenge the death of his good friend.
That's when everything went wrong.
It's just a few days before Christmas in the capital city of Hartford, Connecticut.
It's a historic city. It's a city that used to be the richest in the U.S. There is a lot of diversity here. It's rich with culture, the arts.
Hartford is a super diverse community. You have many Latinos, Puerto Ricans, South American, Central American. You have Bosnians. You have a large Albanian community. It's just African American, Asians, Laotians, you name it, we have it in Hartford.
Saturday, December 20th, 2014. Around 5:30 in the morning, a resident of the apartment building near Colt Park is startled by a loud noise.
She sees a man. He's clutching his arm. The person is bleeding profusely. He's obviously in a lot of pain. He gets inside that building and he collapses on the stairwell.
She let him use her cell phone to call 911.
She stays with the man until EMTs and officers with the Hartford Police Department arrive.
That's where he started getting medical treatment by EMS.
He is shot in the shoulder and through the elbow.
Did they know the shooter? He did not want to say who shot him. He did not want to say anything.
Responding officers learned the man's name.
Dedrick Jimenez. DJ is his nickname.
24-year-old DJ says he was shot not far from the apartment building.
He was in his brother's car when he was shot.
DJ reveals that his brother, 23-year-old Hiram Martinez, is still in the car, and he was also shot.
His brother's car is down the street. You can almost see where the vehicle was from where he was.
Investigators find a man slumped over the center console. They can see pretty quickly he's been shot at the back of the head.
Despite the wound, Hiram still has a pulse.
He is transported to the hospital. They're still working on him.
DJ Jimenez and Hiram Martinez weren't born brothers, but came to think of each other as such by way of an intense friendship that began when they were young.
They grew up together in West Hartford, went to Hall High School. People think, well, Hartford, West Hartford, same thing, but very, very different. West Hartford has a smaller town yet urban feel to it.
DJ referred to him as his brother. He'd call Hiram his brother, even though they're not actually related. They were just close friends.
They had a fast friendship and an enduring one. They went through a lot of life together, from their boyhood to their teen years to their adult years.
As a teen, Hiram dreamed of becoming a race car mechanic. But that dream didn't pan out. When he was 20, Hiram and his girlfriend became parents to a baby girl. On December 20th, 2014, both Hiram and DJ are on their way to Hartford Hospital after suffering gunshot wounds during an early morning attack. As the men receive medical care, detectives arrive at the apartment building near the 100-acre Colt Park.
It's an area that's usually full of happy times and families and sporting events. But on this occasion, on this day, police tape is surrounding the scene.
I was asked to respond to the crime scene and assume the role as the lead investigator.
Along with Detective Richter, siblings Anthony and Mike Rakowski are also on the case.
My brother is my twin, so to be able to work with him on such, high responsibility cases is it's really an amazing thing. He brings a certain view to the table, a little bit different than mine sometimes, and we bounce back and forth off each other, and it makes for a much more well-rounded investigation.
Detectives begin their investigation in the stairwell where DJ took refuge.
We're trying to get as much information as possible, as quickly as we can. So just went over there, saw what was there, which is a little blood and, some EMS equipment that they used to treat him, and then just backtracked. So I just started walking from there back towards the vehicle.
They examined the car, where the second victim, Hiram, was found.
I observed the doors open, 2 doors open.
You could see blood. You could see kind of where the victims were in the front seats when they were shot.
Hiram Martinez had been seated in the front passenger seat, and DJ was the operator of the vehicle.
That leads investigators to an important conclusion about where the shots came from.
So Hiram shot in the back of the head, and then Dedrick is shot in the shoulder and through the elbow. And if you imagine a Honda Accord, with a center console and the driver sitting in the driver position, that's consistent with being shot from the back seat. The shooter's in the back seat.
It appears likely to investigators that DJ and Hiram knew the person who shot them.
We didn't really find any shell casings outside the car. I think we maybe found a cigarette butt outside the car. We don't know if that was connected.
Investigators will have to wait for a warrant to conduct a detailed search of the vehicle. With the crime scene giving up few clues, detectives head to Hartford Hospital to speak with the victims.
They have to start figuring out why. What's the motive? Why did someone want to hurt or potentially kill both of these men? They go to the hospital. That's where DJ has had successful surgery on his shoulder and elbow. He's got permanent rods put in both.
Detectives learned that the man DJ called his brother is not so lucky.
Hiram Martinez, he died later at the hospital. We had a homicide.
Detectives speak with DJ, who is still claiming to know nothing about the attack.
We're trying to get as much information as possible, as quickly as we can. He gave us bits and pieces.
The initial information he provided was, I don't want to say misleading, but it was not complete. He initially provides information that he never saw the shooter. He claims that he didn't know who shot them, that he was in a vehicle. He took off running.
Witnesses don't want to be witnesses. People are scared. They don't want to be the one that snitches.
No one wants to be, considered a snitch.
Investigators share with DJ that his beloved brother and best friend, Hiram, has died.
When he finds out that Hiram Martinez, his childhood best friend, is dead, that's when everything changed.
He started giving information about who the person was.
Now that DJ's willing to talk, investigators are all ears. And it turns out DJ has a lot to say.
The individual who shot them goes by the street name Papone.
In Hartford, Connecticut, police are investigating an early morning double shooting just days before Christmas in 2014. 24-year-old DJ Jimenez survived wounds to the shoulder and arm. His best friend, 23-year-old Hiram Martinez, was not as fortunate.
He's been shot at the back of the head, and he is pronounced dead.
After learning of his best friend's death, DJ cooperates with detectives. He says he knows who fired the shots.
That was when DJ provided the information that an individual he knows as Papone was the person who shot him.
It was someone he met during a stint in prison. Both were on parole.
DJ tells detectives he and Hiram ran into Papone the night before.
DJ says that he was out with his bro. They were hanging, having some drinks, going to some clubs.
And he had explained that they had all been at an after-hours party off of Park Street in Hartford. And he and Hiram had had contact with Papone at that party.
So there's DJ, Papone, and Hiram all hanging out. They're having drinks. It's a good time. It's really late at night, early in the morning, and it seems all good. At one point, DJ has to use the restroom, and that's when Hiram and Papone have time together themselves.
DJ tells detectives that when he came back, Papone's mood was starkly different.
His whole disposition changed. He wasn't talkative anymore. He knew something was wrong or something was off with this guy.
Everything seemed to be fine, but now something has changed drastically. He explains to investigators something wasn't right. He didn't know what at the time.
According to DJ, Hiram pulled him aside a few moments later. He claimed that Papone became upset when Hiram started talking about another crime, one that took place about a week prior.
Hiram had actually somewhat bragged at the fact that he had killed Mariano Gonzalez on Bond Street to Papone.
Investigators interviewing DJ immediately recognized the crime DJ is referring to.
When they're hearing DJ say this, now alarm bells are going off in their head. We might have a payback. This might be a retaliation.
My brother was assigned as the lead investigator in that case. I was called in to assist.
December 14th, 2014, we had patrol officers dispatched to the area. It was about almost 2 a.m. on the report of shots fired and then another call of a person shot. Officers went out to the scene. At that time, they located a victim with a gunshot wound to the head. He was pronounced deceased on scene.
The victim was 37-year-old Mariano Gonzalez.
This crime scene was fairly limited in size in the sense that it was contained to really the driveway and the street immediately in front of there. There wasn't too much for evidence at that scene other than the deceased himself. Once the initial photographs are done, and then we can kind of roll the deceased over to get a better look at him, we discovered that he had a cell phone in his pocket and he had ammunition, rifle caliber ammunition.
When investigators questioned onlookers at the scene, they learned that one woman witnessed the actual shooting.
She heard an argument outside. She heard some foul language, caused her to look out the window, and she sees the suspect shoot our victim one time. The victim falls. She sees him shoot a second time. After he shot a second time, the suspect goes through, by her account, goes through the victim's pockets. She believed he took a watch off of his wrist. As the suspect stood up, he then kicked the victim in the face and then ran away. She described him as thin, right? Very thin. He was shorter than the victim.
When detectives broke the news of Mariano's death to his family, they hoped they might also uncover a lead.
It's a huge priority for us to open up that line of communication with family and implore them to actually give us information.
But instead, Mariano's brother flew into a rage.
The brother was very aggressive, like very, very aggressive. I understand he's grieving, people process that differently. So we kind of let him be. The brother shut the door on us, like, we're done, we're not talking to you. So we didn't really get anywhere as far as establishing a timeline there or any cooperation with family.
The major challenge initially was the victim's family's lack of cooperation.
They didn't want anything to do with it, I guess because of the fear of retaliation. And you find out a lot of people don't want to get involved.
Eventually, investigators did gain access to Mariano's cell phone.
We were able to take one of the last phone numbers that had made contact with the victim and link that to Hiram Martinez. The contact, if I recall, was about 30 minutes prior to the calls for the shots fired.
Hiram also matched the description of the shooter given by the woman who witnessed the crime.
And now we have eyewitnesses giving us a description of a person consistent with Hiram Martinez. It's really starting to point towards Hiram Martinez. We're still far away from calling him a suspect. He's just someone that we want to talk to.
But before detectives could question Hiram, he too was gunned down. Back at Hartford Hospital, Hiram's best friend, DJ, tells investigators that Hiram bragged about shooting Mariano to the man who eventually shot both him and Hiram.
According to DJ, Hiram told Pepone that he killed Mariano.
We immediately suspected that there was a connection to the original Bond Street case.
Police in Hartford, Connecticut are investigating the shooting death of 23-year-old Hiram Martinez. They believe his death could be related to a shooting that claimed the life of Mariano Gonzalez just 6 days before. A killing that Hiram was suspected of carrying out.
Although we suspected that, we don't fixate on that because it's very easy to fixate on an avenue like that and then you overlook a second potential suspect. We've seen commonly that people have multiple adversaries and multiple avenues of people that want to harm them. So, although we believed it wholeheartedly, we had to remain open-minded.
So far, the only person investigators can count on for information is the sole surviving victim of the second shooting, DJ Jimenez. As DJ recovers in a local hospital, detectives continue to press him for details.
He told us bits and pieces through multiple interviews. We met with Mr. Jimenez several times, different detectives, myself, to try to piece together what occurred. This happened over a course of a few interviews.
Over time, DJ expands on what happened when Pepone's mood had changed that night at the club, after Hiram had bragged about shooting Mariano.
It's getting late, and clearly the fun is starting to feel like it's over. Pepone's not in a good mood.
They were leaving, and Pepone had asked them to give him a ride to his girlfriend's house.
They didn't want to give him a ride. Eventually, reluctantly, I guess they did give him a ride.
DJ explains he was driving with Pepone in the back and Hiram in the passenger seat. Pepone said he needed some cigarettes. They stopped at a convenience store.
Pepone wants Martinez to get the cigarettes. Martinez doesn't want to get the cigarettes. The bantering and the arguing is going on. Finally, DJ says, I'll get the cigarettes. He goes into the convenience store. He comes out with the cigarettes. Now, supposedly, they're on their way.
Then, Pepone requested another stop. This time so he could relieve himself. He tells DJ to pull over near Cold Park.
They pull up next to a grassy knoll on the outside of the park, and Pepone gets out. DJ tells investigators that he can see Pepone, and Pepone is not so far away, but he's on his cell phone. And he watches him on his cell phone, probably doesn't think too much of it, waits for him to get back to the car.
Shortly thereafter, he gets back in the vehicle, And that's when Jimenez hears a loud bang, covers his ears, he realizes it's a gunshot, gets out of the car, starts running.
For investigators, it raises concern that the cycle of retaliation might continue. But that leaves them with a burning question. Who is Papone?
Street names are street names. They could be used by anybody.
Detectives know they need to ID Papone quickly before the bloodshed continues.
We don't want to see retaliatory violence. Anytime we have a crime of violence like this, we are very concerned about retaliation. A lot of times we see family members or close friends of victims, if they hear a name, whether it's true or not, they want to go retaliate.
Investigators aren't the only ones who are worried.
This was a crime 5 days before Christmas. The crime on Bond Street was just a week prior. This was something that really rocked the Hartford community. This was yet another homicide in a city reeling from way more than their fair share. This was something that people who lived in the area were stunned by. They were startled, they were shaken, they were scared.
Detectives hunker down, focused on finding Papone's true identity.
We will take those street names and we'll enter them into certain databases that we have, or we ask, DOC contacts, probation contacts, anybody who's familiar with somebody utilizing this street name.
We just had his nickname, and we were able to identify who he was through, our channels with the Department of Correction, because he uses that nickname, Papone, before.
We were able to take the street name information obtained from DJ. We were able to determine that Papone was, in fact, Tyrone Rosa.
To make sure they have the right guy, investigators show DJ a photo lineup.
We created a photo array. In that array, it contains our potential suspect as well as individuals who look similar.
It didn't take any time at all for DJ to say, that's him.
He did make a positive ID of Tyrone Rosa as being the person that was in the car.
In Hartford, Connecticut, detectives believe they're getting closer to finding the killer of Hiram Martinez, after Hiram's best friend, DJ, identifies Tyrone Rosa as the gunman.
After we identified Papone, or Tyrone Rosa, we just started doing a workup, a background on him to figure out where he lives, all this pertinent information.
Before they attempt to bring him in for questioning, detectives do some digging on Tyrone. They learn he was close with the murder victim, Mariano Gonzalez, and his brother, the man who'd flown into a rage in front of police upon learning of Mariano's death.
He knew Mariano, but the relationship that Papone had with his brother was far deeper than investigators first realized. They found out later, via social media, that this was someone that Papone cared deeply about. He said he loved him, he would die for him.
But investigators speculate that Hiram had no idea the man he was socializing with at the club was so close to a man he claimed to have killed.
Tyrone and Mariano Gonzalez's brother and Mariano Gonzalez were actually friends. We don't believe that Hiram knew that when he was bragging about that homicide.
Tyrone may have wanted to retaliate because Hiram Martinez admitted to killing the brother of one of his closest friends.
Investigators also learned that the 35-year-old Tyrone Rosa is no stranger to the law.
He was on parole, which is great for us because that gives us access for an interview. And that's what we did. We ended up having his parole officer bring him up to the Major Crimes Division for an interview.
17 days after Hiram and DJ were shot, Tyrone Rosa is brought in for questioning with detectives, grudgingly.
He didn't seem nervous, per se. He definitely seemed very closed off and reluctant to speak. He was keeping his cards close to his chest.
Detectives keep at it.
We started getting to the meat of it, asking him if he knew certain people, if he was at an after-hours club with them. He, seemed reluctant to speak, but then he started giving us some information, saying he was at an after-hours club with Mr. Martinez and Mr. Jimenez.
At this point, the story is starting to line up a little bit with DJ's, but this is where the story changes.
Tyrone claims he didn't leave the club with DJ and Hiram.
He said he never went with them in the vehicle, that he stayed at the after-hours club, and they left by themselves. When I knew he was lying, that's a good sign, actually, for me. I like when people lie in an interview. You know you're getting close.
As for the victim of the first shooting, Mariano Gonzalez, Tyrone says he had no reason to avenge that death.
He said that he doesn't really know the other victim, which was Mr. Gonzalez, and his brother, kind of downplayed it. He said he knew of them, didn't really associate with them. He kept trying to downplay his association with the victim.
Investigators aren't buying it.
He didn't really want to admit that he was really close friends with him. We knew he was close friends with his brother. That's our belief for why this occurred.
Speculation isn't enough to bring murder charges, but investigators do find a way to keep Tyrone behind bars.
Because Mr. Rosa was on parole at the time, and he was a suspect in a homicide, his parole was violated, so he's remanded to custody.
Investigators keep close tabs on Tyrone. The day after his arrest, he makes a phone call from jail to Mariano's brother.
We already said he wasn't close to him, so why are you calling this guy if you don't really associate with him? So that, obviously, we knew he was lying.
That's not all. He asks Mariano's brother for a favor.
He also started telling this guy to destroy his phone, which is like, if you have no involvement in it, why are you telling someone to destroy their phones?
In late December 2014, police in Hartford, Connecticut are holding Tyrone Rosa in connection with the shooting death of 23-year-old Hiram Martinez. Detectives believe that Tyrone killed Hiram in retaliation for the death of his friend, Mariano Gonzalez.
He denied shooting Mr. Jimenez or Mr. Martinez. He said, I never went with them to the car.
But the day after Tyrone is taken into custody, he makes a jailhouse phone call to Mariano's brother, requesting that he tell a man named CL to destroy his phone. Investigators want to know why. They track down CL.
He was on probation for a gun arrest, so we interviewed him at his probation office.
CL admits he was with Tyrone that night.
He's friends with Tyrone Rosa, and he was with Mr. Rosa at the After Hours Club prior to the incident.
Eventually, Tyrone left the club.
He just went, didn't know where he went. Mr. Rosa didn't tell him.
Then, around 5:30 a.m., minutes after the shooting would have taken place, CL called Tyrone to ask him where he had gone. Tyrone didn't say, but asked CL to pick him up at a location near Colt Park.
He went and picked him up near the crime scene. I don't even think he knew what Mr. Rosa did, because I asked him all that, and he just picked him up and was doing him a favor.
CL's statement appears to contradict what Tyrone told detectives.
Mr. Rosa denied, obviously, being in that car, so if you weren't in that car, you're not being picked up by the crime scene. We found the guy who picked him up by the crime scene.
In order to charge Tyrone with murder, investigators need more. They need evidence. They hope the vehicle in which Hiram and DJ were shot might give them just that.
We obtain a search warrant to process that car. The crime scene division will process it, and they'll look for all different kinds of physical evidence: DNA, fingerprints, shell casings, firearms, anything that's in there that we ask them to look for. They found a fingerprint on the inside rear door handle, which it's actually pretty rare to get a usable fingerprint. But they did recover a fingerprint, and that print later did hit to Tyrone Rosa.
Now they know what he told them about not being anywhere near the crime scene, not still being in the car, was not true. They placed Tyrone at the scene of the murder.
Though it doesn't prove he pulled the trigger, the fingerprint is the final piece of evidence investigators need to bring Tyrone Rosa one important step closer to justice.
With that positive ID, with the physical evidence to support it, that was enough.
At this point, the lead investigator will take all this information and compile it into an arrest warrant, and that's exactly what he did.
On February 18th, 2015, nearly 2 months after Hiram Martinez and DJ Jimenez were shot, Tyrone Rosa is charged with murder, first-degree assault, and criminal gun possession.
Mr. Rosa was arrested for the murder of one gentleman, assault on another gentleman.
He was already remanded to custody because he was on parole, so he's in jail already.
But will prosecutors be able to keep him there?
Throughout the court proceedings, he maintained his innocence. He said, "Someone killed him, but it wasn't me."
On February 2nd, 2015, in Hartford Superior Court, Tyrone Rosa goes on trial for the murder of Hiram Martinez and the assault of DJ Jimenez. In court, Tyrone is stoic.
He was very calm and didn't seem nervous or excited. He's kind of a low energy type of guy.
Prosecutors argue that Tyrone was out for revenge after Hiram told him that he killed Mariano Gonzalez.
The claim was that Mr. Rosa had killed this one gentleman for revenge for a friend of his that had been killed. My client gave a very different version. There was this unknown third person who my client says put a gun to his head and presumably committed the shooting.
There was one young man who really had this expectation of himself to do what was right or what was considered the admirable thing to do and avenge the death of his good friend, his friend's brother. There's no alternative other than to take the same lethal action that was used against the person that you loved.
DJ takes the stand as the state's star witness. He walks the jury through details of Mariano's murder, according to what Hiram told him.
Hiram met up with Mariano Gonzalez on Bond Street in Hartford. He was supposed to buy a gun. DJ says, changed his mind. Now Hiram doesn't want to buy the gun. Mariano was basically set on selling this gun. You're buying this gun. And that's when everything went wrong.
Mariano Gonzalez had actually threatened Hiram Martinez's family.
Hiram has a 3-year-old child and a significant other that clearly he cared about very much. So when someone threatened to wipe out his family, this did not sit the right way. DJ says that's when Hiram told him that he killed Mariano Gonzalez in cold blood.
A week later at the club, When Tyrone Rosa learned that Hiram killed Mariano, Tyrone then set his sights on Hiram. On the stand, DJ recalls the chilling moment that claimed his best friend's life.
Tyrone got out to use the bathroom. They didn't think anything of that, and as he got back in the car, DJ claims he heard a loud bang, covered his ears, realized it was a shooting, got out and ran. At that point, he realized he had been shot as well.
As the defense gets underway, Tyrone Rosa takes the stand.
He admitted to lying to police, and the reason why he lied was because he was on parole and didn't want his parole remanded.
Tyrone admits he did drive around with DJ and Hiram that night.
The police found my client's fingerprints in the car. My client didn't dispute having been in the car. Everybody agreed that he had been in the car. The question was he the shooter?
But Tyrone insists he was not.
There was no forensic evidence that directly tied my client to the shooting. They didn't find the murder weapon, for example. They didn't find any DNA on anything that directly linked my client to the murder. So the lack of that sort of evidence made the trial a credibility contest.
Tyrone offers up what he claims is the truth about what happened that night.
My client testified that while he was urinating, somebody came up behind him, put a gun to his head, and told him, "Don't move. This isn't about you." And then he heard a couple gunshots. Went back to the car where the deceased and Mr. Jimenez were, saw that the deceased had been shot, and took off running.
He basically denied being the person to pull the trigger, and he said it was somebody else who he couldn't identify who was responsible for the murder. He didn't provide any information as far as description or who might have been the person who did this.
Once all the testimony was heard in court, it was up to the jurors to decide this case. It didn't take them long before they came back, and on February 14th, their verdict was guilty.
At sentencing, Tyrone shows no remorse and continues to claim innocence.
And to this day, he's still saying that he's innocent.
The judge sees things differently.
He spoke of the senseless cycle of violence, the tragic nature in which a domino effect happened with these crimes that led to a payback. And Tyrone Rosa was about to pay.
Mr. Rosa was sentenced to 55 years for the murder of Mr. Martinez, and he got an additional 15 years for shooting Mr. Jimenez.
For investigators, this was a relief. They had a conviction. Tyrone Papone Rosa. But remember, there were two crimes here. The payback was preceded by the murder of Mariano Gonzalez.
There was a witness that, in fact, saw the shooter go through the victim's pockets. DNA testing was done from the victim's pockets, and the recovered DNA evidence actually came back to Hiram Martinez.
Not only did we have the story now of Hiram Martinez telling DJ that he did commit the crime in the murder of Mariano Gonzalez, but DNA evidence confirmed it.
Closed cases cannot fill the holes left by loved ones who will never return.
At 5:21 in the afternoon on August 9, 1991, the summer light was beginning to soften over Calabria. It was the kind of late afternoon that could make a dangerous place look peaceful. The roads around Reggio Calabria were familiar to the people who lived there. The hills fell toward the Mediterranean. The air carried the warmth of August. Cars moved along winding stretches of asphalt, and somewhere beyond the roads, the sea was still holding the heat of the day. For Antonino Scopoliti, this should have been an ordinary summer evening. He was 56 years old. He was a senior prosecutor of Italy's highest criminal court, a man who had spent decades walking through some of the darkest chapters of the country's recent history. He had worked on cases involving terrorism, political violence, organized crime, and some of the most notorious acts of violence Italy had endured. But on that afternoon, he was not sitting inside a courtroom. He was not surrounded by judges. He was not reading a legal brief beneath the cold lights of a government building. He was simply driving home. His BMW moved along the road between Ferrito and Piali, in the area of Villa San Giovanni and Campo Calabro. The route was not some distant wilderness. It was part of the landscape of his own Calabria, the land where he had been born. And somewhere ahead, someone was waiting for him. That is the detail that makes the story so difficult to forget. The people waiting for Antonino Scopoliti did not need to chase him. They did not need to force their way into his home. They did not need to confront him face to face. They knew the road. They knew the route. And, according to the reconstruction that would later emerge, they knew that sooner or later the man they wanted would drive into the perfect position. A curve in the road. A passing moment. A vehicle moving through the late afternoon light. Then violence. The attack was sudden. Scopoliti was struck by shotgun fire in the head. The force of the blast took away the possibility of a response. His BMW lost control and left the roadway. For the outside world, the scene could initially have looked like a terrible accident. A car had gone off the road. A man was dead. But this was not an accident. The man inside that vehicle had been deliberately targeted. And the weapon had not been aimed at an ordinary citizen. It had been aimed at one of the men standing between organized crime and the Italian justice system. Antonino Scopoliti was preparing to take part in the final stage of the Maxi trial, the enormous judicial assault against Cosa Nostra that had shaken the mafia's power in Sicily. The case had already become one of the defining battles between the Italian state and organized crime. Hundreds of mafia members had been prosecuted. Years of investigation had been transformed into evidence. Names that had once been whispered in fear had been spoken openly in court. The hierarchy of Cosa Nostra had been dragged into the light. And after the lower stages of the proceedings, the case had reached the highest level of Italy's judicial system. The final battle was approaching. Scopoliti was expected to represent the prosecution before the Court of Cassation. His task was not a minor administrative formality. The Court of Cassation represented the final judicial stage in the case. The convictions obtained through the Maxi trial were moving toward a moment that could determine whether the enormous effort against Cosa Nostra would ultimately stand. For the mafia, this was not simply another courtroom. It was a threat to the structure of power itself. And then, months before Scopoliti was expected to perform that role, he was dead. The timing was impossible to ignore. It immediately created a question that would haunt the investigation for decades. Who benefited from Antonino Scopoliti's death? The question sounds simple. It was anything but. Because the answer seemed to lead into a world where criminal organizations did not always operate separately. Sicily had Cosa Nostra. Calabria had the 'Ndrangheta. Two different criminal systems. Two different territories. Different histories. Different internal structures. Yet by the early 1990s, investigators and prosecutors were increasingly confronted with indications that the boundaries between these organizations could become blurred when their interests aligned. The killing of Scopoliti would become one of the most disturbing examples of that possibility. One theory suggested that Cosa Nostra wanted Scopoliti eliminated because of the role he was about to play in the Maxi trial. But if the decision came from Sicily, why would the murder take place in Calabria? Why would a Sicilian organization need local assistance? And what could one criminal organization offer another in return for the death of a senior Italian prosecutor? Those questions would eventually lead investigators toward some of the most powerful families of the Calabrian underworld. But on August 9, 1991, none of that was visible to the man behind the wheel. There was only the road. Only the car. Only the distance between where he was and where he intended to go. And somewhere along that road, the people waiting for him knew exactly what they were about to do. The murder of Antonino Scopoliti was not an act of uncontrolled rage. It had the appearance of preparation. The attackers did not need to create chaos across an entire city. They needed only a few seconds. That is one of the most chilling characteristics of a targeted assassination. The victim experiences the world as ordinary until the precise second when it is no longer ordinary. A road remains a road. A car remains a car. A familiar turn remains a familiar turn. Until someone decides that this particular stretch of asphalt will become the final place a human being ever sees. Scopoliti's death therefore raised another question. How long had the attackers been watching? How much did they know about his movements? How did they know where he would be? And who had enough knowledge of his routine to turn an ordinary journey into an ambush? There were no dramatic warnings for the public to see. There was no televised declaration of war. There was no public confrontation. There was simply a prosecutor traveling through his home region during the summer. And a hidden threat waiting beyond the next bend. Antonino Scopoliti had spent much of his professional life dealing with people who believed that violence could solve problems. He had seen the consequences of terrorism. He had worked on cases connected to political violence and organized crime. He had confronted the machinery of criminal power through the legal system. His weapon was the law. Their weapon was a shotgun. And on that afternoon, the distance between those two worlds collapsed into a few seconds. The tragedy becomes even more striking when we remember what Scopoliti was preparing to do. He was not going to lead a police raid. He was not carrying a gun into a criminal stronghold. He was preparing to stand in court and argue for the law. The mafia had spent years trying to survive the scrutiny of investigators, prosecutors, judges, and witnesses. The Maxi trial had threatened to transform that struggle. If the convictions survived the final judicial review, the consequences for Cosa Nostra would be enormous. That made Scopoliti's role extraordinarily sensitive. His death, therefore, could not be viewed in isolation. It belonged to a much larger story. A story about an organization that feared the courtroom. A story about men who had built power through intimidation and murder. A story about prosecutors who continued working despite knowing what happened to those who challenged that power. And a story about two criminal worlds that may have discovered that cooperation could be more valuable than rivalry. Years later, investigators would examine statements from collaborators of justice. Some would describe an alleged connection between Cosa Nostra and factions of the 'Ndrangheta. Some accounts suggested that the Calabrian organization had been asked to carry out the killing. Other testimony introduced the idea of a broader bargain, one in which criminal interests in Sicily and Calabria could exchange favors. There were even allegations that Scopoliti had been approached with an offer of money intended to persuade him to change his position concerning the Maxi trial. According to that account, he refused. But these allegations would never form a simple, uncontested narrative. That is essential to understanding the case. The story of Antonino Scopoliti is not a story in which every mystery was eventually solved. It is almost the opposite. The more investigators looked, the more layers appeared. There were informants. There were competing accounts. There were suspected mafia bosses. There were alleged intermediaries. There were judicial proceedings. There were convictions at one stage and acquittals at another. There were theories about alliances that crossed regional criminal boundaries. And behind all of it was one undeniable fact. Antonino Scopoliti was dead. The man who was supposed to stand before Italy's highest criminal court was no longer alive to make his case. And that absence was itself powerful. A prosecutor does not need to raise his voice to threaten a criminal organization. He only needs to enter a courtroom carrying evidence. Scopoliti represented precisely that kind of threat. His authority did not come from physical strength. It came from the possibility that the state could take the hidden world of organized crime, expose it under the rules of law, and make its members answer for what they had done. That possibility had terrified criminal organizations for generations. Now the prosecutor was gone. The question was no longer whether Scopoliti would appear before the Court of Cassation. He would not. The question became whether his murder had been designed to influence the fate of the Maxi trial itself. That question would become one of the central mysteries surrounding his assassination. And it would eventually connect his death to a period that would become one of the bloodiest chapters in modern Italian history. Within months, Italy would witness further attacks against the state. In 1992, Giovanni Falcone would be killed in a massive bombing near Capaci. Not long afterward, Paolo Borsellino would be murdered in Palermo. The following years would bring further mafia violence and bombings. Seen from the distance of history, Scopoliti's assassination appears not as an isolated explosion of violence, but as part of a terrifying escalation. The message was becoming clearer. The mafia was willing to strike at the people who represented the state. Not only police officers. Not only informants. Not only rivals. Judges. Prosecutors. People whose work threatened the organization at its foundations. But in August 1991, that larger chapter had not yet been written. There was only one body beside a road in Calabria. There was a damaged BMW. There was the terrible evidence that the death had not been accidental. And there was a family suddenly forced to understand that the man they loved had been deliberately taken from them. For the people who knew Antonino Scopoliti as a prosecutor, his death could be understood through headlines, investigations, and legal theories. For his family, it was something far more immediate. A familiar voice was gone. A chair would remain empty. A journey that should have ended at home had ended on a roadside. And no theory about mafia strategy could change that simple human fact. A man had left home. He never returned. More than 3 decades later, the location of that murder would still attract investigators. In 2025, new examinations were carried out at the site, with investigators using Scopoliti's vehicle to reconstruct the circumstances of the attack and reconsider positions, angles, and the physical dynamics of the shooting. That detail is extraordinary. More than 30 years had passed. The people who first arrived at the scene were long gone from the immediate investigation. The world had changed. Technology had changed. Italy had changed. The mafia had changed. Yet investigators were still returning to the same road, still asking the same fundamental questions. Where were the attackers? Where was Scopoliti's car? How exactly did the shooting happen? What could the physical evidence tell investigators that testimony had failed to establish? And perhaps most importantly, who gave the order? Because that is where this story truly begins. Not with the courtroom. Not with the suspects. Not even with the gunfire. It begins with a man who believed that justice could operate through evidence, procedure, and the authority of the state. And with the people who may have believed that a shotgun could make that authority disappear. On August 9, 1991, Antonino Scopoliti was driving through Calabria. He was approaching the end of his journey. He had no reason to believe that the road ahead had been chosen for him. He could not see the men waiting beyond the curve. He could not know that his name was already part of a much larger calculation. He could not know that his death would become linked to the highest levels of organized crime in Italy. And he could not know that the investigation into his murder would survive for decades without producing a final answer capable of silencing every doubt. The road was quiet. The afternoon was moving toward evening. The sea was nearby. And somewhere ahead, the men who had been waiting finally saw the car. They had their target. They had their opportunity. And within seconds, the prosecutor who had spent his life trying to make criminals answer before the law would become another victim of the very system he had fought against. The gunfire ended Antonino Scopoliti's life. But it did not end the questions. Who ordered the assassination? Who carried it out? Was Cosa Nostra acting alone? Did the 'Ndrangheta provide the killers? Was there a secret bargain between the two organizations? Was Scopoliti murdered because of what he was about to say in the Court of Cassation? And if his death was intended to alter the course of justice, how far did that plan reach? Those questions would follow the case through years of investigations, conflicting testimony, courtroom battles, acquittals, reopened inquiries, and new attempts to reconstruct the crime. And perhaps that is what makes the story of Antonino Scopoliti so haunting. The mafia may have been able to silence the man, but it could not silence the question. What really happened on that road in Calabria on the afternoon of August 9, 1991? To answer that, we have to go back. Back before the gunfire. Back before the BMW left the road. Back before Scopoliti became a name associated with an unsolved assassination. We have to meet the man first. We have to understand the Italy he lived in. We have to understand the criminal world he confronted. And we have to understand why, in the summer of 1991, the name Antonino Scopoliti may have become dangerous enough for someone to decide that he had to disappear. Before Antonino Scopoliti became the man lying beside a road in Calabria, before his name appeared in headlines connected to one of the most troubling mafia assassinations in modern Italian history, there was a place that had learned to live with two very different realities at the same time. One was beautiful. The other was dangerous. Calabria stretches along the southernmost part of mainland Italy, a long, mountainous region pushed between the Tyrrhenian and Ionian seas. From a distance, it can look almost untouched by the violence that would later become associated with its name. Mountains descend toward the water. Small communities cling to hillsides. Roads wind through landscapes where the Mediterranean light can make everything appear almost unreal. In summer, the heat settles over the region early and stays late. The roads shimmer beneath the sun. The smell of dry earth mixes with the salt carried inland from the sea. Houses become quiet during the hottest hours of the afternoon, while people wait for the worst of the heat to pass. But beneath that familiar rhythm existed another Calabria. A Calabria of loyalties, family structures, territorial control, and criminal organizations whose influence did not always need to announce itself. The most powerful of those organizations was the 'Ndrangheta. Unlike the image many outsiders had of organized crime at the time, the 'Ndrangheta did not necessarily need to control every street openly. Its strength often came from relationships, blood ties, family connections, silence, fear. The ability to know who belonged to whom, who could be trusted, who owed a favor, and who could be pressured. In Calabria, the word family could carry a meaning far beyond the private world of parents, children, brothers, and cousins. For the criminal clans known as Cosce, family could become the foundation of power. That structure would later matter enormously in the investigation into Antonino Scopoliti's murder. Because when a prosecutor was killed on a public road, investigators were not simply looking for an angry individual with a weapon. They were entering a world in which orders could travel through layers of relationships. One man might make a request. Another might pass it along. A third might provide the men. Someone else might know the road. And the people who actually pulled the trigger might never be the people who had decided that the victim should die. That was one of the greatest challenges facing Italian investigators in the fight against organized crime. The violence could be visible. The command structure could remain invisible. By the beginning of the 1990s, however, Calabria was not the only part of Italy struggling with this problem. Across the Strait of Messina, Sicily was facing an even more dramatic confrontation. There, Cosa Nostra had spent decades building a criminal empire. Its influence extended into business, politics, public contracts, and local institutions. It was not simply a collection of criminals committing isolated crimes. It was an organized system capable of enforcing its will through intimidation and murder. And by 1991, that system was under extraordinary pressure. The reason was the Maxi trial. To understand why Antonino Scopoliti became a target, it is necessary to understand what the Maxi trial represented. 4 years, the Italian state had struggled to penetrate the internal structure of Cosa Nostra. The organization was protected by secrecy and silence. Witnesses were frightened. Investigators faced enormous obstacles. People who knew too much understood that speaking could cost them their lives. Then came a new generation of investigators and prosecutors who began to change the way the mafia was understood. Among them were Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. They did not simply investigate individual murders. They tried to understand the organization itself. They followed money. They examined relationships. They questioned collaborators. They connected apparently separate crimes. And, perhaps most importantly, they treated Cosa Nostra as a structured organization rather than an endless collection of unrelated criminals. That approach changed everything. The investigations produced a vast body of evidence. The result was the Maxi trial, a judicial confrontation on a scale that Italy had rarely seen. Hundreds of defendants were placed before the court. The accusations covered murder, drug trafficking, extortion, mafia association, and other crimes. For Cosa Nostra, the proceedings represented a direct attack on the organization's legitimacy and power. The courtroom became another battlefield. But this was a battlefield where the mafia could not simply rely on intimidation. The state had brought evidence. The prosecutors had brought witnesses. The investigators had brought years of work. And the judges had to decide whether the enormous case against Cosa Nostra could withstand judicial scrutiny. The stakes were enormous. If the convictions held, the consequences would reach deep into the structure of Sicilian organized crime. If they collapsed, it would send an entirely different message. The state could investigate. The state could arrest. The state could prosecute. But perhaps the state could not ultimately defeat the mafia in court. That possibility mattered. Because organized crime survives not only through violence. It survives through the belief that violence works. It survives when people believe that speaking is useless. It survives when witnesses remain silent because they expect no protection. It survives when criminals believe that the legal system can be manipulated, delayed, or defeated. The Maxi trial challenged that belief. And by 1991, the case was moving toward one of its most important stages. The Court of Cassation. This was where Antonino Scopoliti entered the story. Scopoliti had spent decades inside the Italian justice system. He was not an inexperienced prosecutor suddenly thrown into a dangerous case. He had worked on some of the country's most sensitive investigations and judicial proceedings. His professional history included cases involving terrorism, political violence, mafia-related crimes, and major acts of violence that had shaken Italy. He had seen what happened when criminal organizations decided that law enforcement was an enemy. He understood the risks. He also understood the difference between suspicion and proof. That distinction would become painfully important after his death. In May 1991, Scopoliti accepted the role that would place him at the center of the final judicial stage of the Maxi trial. He was expected to serve as the prosecution's representative before the Court of Cassation. It was a position of enormous responsibility. The case had already consumed years of investigative work. Now the legal battle was approaching the highest level. And suddenly, the man responsible for arguing the prosecution's position became more than a prosecutor. He became a potential obstacle. To understand how serious that could be, imagine the criminal world watching the proceedings from outside the courtroom. For years, men accustomed to controlling neighborhoods and intimidating witnesses were now watching lawyers debate evidence and legal principles. They could not simply threaten a judge in open court. They could not make the evidence disappear with a phone call. They could not erase years of investigation by force. But they could try to remove one of the people standing between themselves and the final judgment. That is the context in which Scopoliti's death must be viewed. Not as a random act of violence. Not as a personal dispute. But as a murder occurring at a moment when the Italian justice system was preparing to make an extremely important decision about Cosa Nostra. And yet the story becomes even more complicated when we return to Calabria. Because Scopoliti was not in Sicily when he died. He was in his native Calabria. That geographical fact would become one of the most important pieces of the mystery. The people who wanted him dead, according to one of the major investigative theories, were connected to Cosa Nostra. But the killing happened in territory where the 'Ndrangheta had deep roots. That raised the possibility of cooperation. And cooperation between criminal organizations is rarely simple. Organizations built on territorial control do not casually allow outsiders to operate in their territory. If a Sicilian group wanted someone killed in Calabria, local relationships could matter. Who controlled the area? Who could provide information? Who could identify the victim's routine? Who could arrange the ambush? Who could make sure the killers could enter and leave without attracting attention? These were the questions that investigators would eventually confront. But on the surface, Calabria remained deceptively ordinary. That is one of the most disturbing things about organized crime. It does not always announce itself with men in masks or gunfire. Sometimes it hides behind normality. A cafe opens in the morning. A shopkeeper raises the shutters. A family drives toward the coast. Children play. Workers go home. People buy bread. Cars pass one another on narrow roads. And somewhere inside that ordinary landscape, a decision may already have been made about who is going to die. The person marked for death may have no idea that anything has changed. Antonino Scopoliti was about to experience exactly that kind of invisible danger. There was no dramatic public confrontation before his murder. He was not surrounded by police officers when he traveled. He was not moving through Calabria as though he expected an attack. He was on vacation. That detail makes the eventual ambush feel even colder. A man who had spent his professional life dealing with danger had returned to the region of his birth. Perhaps the familiarity of the landscape offered a sense of normality. Perhaps it was simply summer. But the people watching him did not see a man on vacation. They saw a prosecutor. They saw the person preparing to appear before the Court of Cassation. They saw a potential threat to a criminal organization that had spent years trying to protect itself from the state. And somewhere, according to the later theories, someone decided that the threat had to be removed. The exact moment that decision was made remains part of the mystery. So does the exact chain of communication. The murder would eventually generate conflicting testimonies from people who claimed knowledge of the criminal world. Some would describe a connection between Cosa Nostra and Calabrian clans. Some would suggest that a favor had been requested. Some would speak about an alleged agreement involving the internal conflicts of the 'Ndrangheta. Others would provide accounts that did not completely fit together. That inconsistency would become one of the greatest obstacles to a definitive judicial reconstruction. But in 1991, investigators did not yet have the benefit of decades of hindsight. They had a dead prosecutor. They had a crime scene. They had a motive that seemed increasingly obvious. And they had a criminal landscape in which silence was not merely a personal choice. Silence could be a survival strategy. This was the world in which the investigation began. A world divided by geography but connected by criminal interests. Sicily on one side of the strait. Calabria on the other. Cosa Nostra. 'Ndrangheta. Two names that represented different histories but shared one fundamental language. Power. And power, when threatened, can become extraordinarily violent. By the summer of 1991, the Italian state had already learned this lesson many times. Investigators and prosecutors had been murdered before. Rocco Cinici had been killed. Other judges and law enforcement officials had been targeted. The memory of these assassinations was still fresh. The message from organized crime was not subtle. There were boundaries. There were consequences. And those who crossed the boundaries could be killed. Yet men like Scopoliti continued to work. That is an important part of his story. It is easy, from the safety of decades later, to describe a prosecutor as courageous. The word becomes almost too simple. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to continue despite understanding the consequences. Scopoliti had spent enough time inside the justice system to understand the world he was confronting. He knew that cases involving powerful criminal organizations could have consequences far beyond the courtroom. He knew that evidence could place lives in danger. He knew that prosecutors could become targets. And yet he accepted the assignment. The summer of 1991 therefore carried an unusual tension. On one side was the slow movement of the legal system. Documents were prepared. Arguments were examined. Judicial proceedings moved forward according to rules and procedure. On the other side was a criminal world accustomed to solving problems through speed. If a prosecutor became an obstacle, the obstacle could be removed. If a witness became dangerous, the witness could disappear. If a rival became inconvenient, the rival could be killed. Two systems were moving toward the same point. One moved through paperwork, hearings, and law. The other moved through secrecy, loyalty, and violence. Antonino Scopoliti stood on one side. The people who would eventually kill him stood on the other. And neither side could yet see exactly how the confrontation would end. The geography of Calabria added another layer to the story. The region's roads were not always straight or predictable. They climbed, curved, and descended through terrain that could provide both visibility and concealment. For someone planning an ambush, a road was more than a way to travel. It was an opportunity. A curve could hide a motorcycle. A slope could conceal movement. A passing vehicle could provide cover. A few seconds could be enough. Investigators would later return to the road where Scopoliti was killed, trying to understand the physical mechanics of the attack. More than 30 years later, they would once again examine the scene and use the original vehicle in an effort to reconstruct what had happened. That alone tells us how many questions remained unanswered. The road had not forgotten. The physical landscape had become evidence. Every curve mattered. Every position mattered. Every angle mattered. Because when a murder is carried out in seconds, investigators may spend decades trying to reconstruct those seconds. And so, as the afternoon of August 9 approached, the larger forces surrounding Antonino Scopoliti were already in motion. The Maxi trial was approaching its decisive stage. Cosa Nostra was facing the possibility of major convictions. Calabria remained deeply influenced by the 'Ndrangheta. Criminal organizations were capable of violence against representatives of the state. And a senior prosecutor had accepted a role that could directly affect the fate of mafia defendants. Then came the summer holiday. Scopoliti returned to Calabria. He moved through a landscape he knew. He traveled without a security escort. There was nothing about the afternoon that announced what was waiting for him. No sirens. No barricades. No warning. Only the long road home. That is where the setting ends and the real nightmare begins. Because once Scopoliti's BMW entered that stretch of road, the enormous forces of Italian organized crime and the Italian justice system were about to collide in a few violent seconds. A courtroom in Rome. A mafia organization in Sicily. A criminal network in Calabria. A prosecutor returning from the sea. And a hidden ambush waiting on the road. All of them were about to become part of the same story. The story of a man who had spent his life asking criminals to answer to the law. And of a criminal world that, for one terrible afternoon, answered with a shotgun. Before Antonino Scopoliti became a name attached to a roadside murder, before his photograph appeared beside headlines about the mafia, before investigators began asking who had ordered his death, he was simply a man who had chosen a difficult profession and spent most of his adult life inside the Italian justice system. He was born in Calabria, the same region where his life would eventually end. That detail gives his story a strange symmetry. The place that had given him his beginnings would one day become the setting of his final journey. At 24 years old, Scopoliti entered the judiciary. 24 is an age when most people are still discovering who they want to become. A young man at that stage of life is usually concerned with work, family, friendships, ambitions, and the ordinary uncertainty of adulthood. Scopoliti, however, chose a profession in which the decisions made behind a desk could eventually place him directly against people who possessed money, weapons, and the willingness to use both. He entered the world of law not knowing exactly where his career would take him. Over the years, it took him across Italy. He worked as a prosecutor in Bergamo, then Rome, then Milan. Different cities, different cases, different environments, but the same basic responsibility: to work within the law and pursue the truth of criminal cases. With every position, his professional experience grew. The young prosecutor who had entered the judiciary at 24 gradually became a senior figure in the Italian justice system. Eventually, Scopoliti reached one of the most important positions available to a prosecutor. He became a substitute prosecutor general at the Court of Cassation, Italy's highest court for criminal and civil appeals. The title may sound distant to someone unfamiliar with the Italian legal system. But behind the title was an enormous responsibility. The Court of Cassation was not simply another courtroom. It stood at the highest level of the judicial structure. Arguments presented there could determine whether decisions made by lower courts would survive the final stages of appeal. For a prosecutor, reaching that level meant that decades of professional experience had led to a position where words, legal reasoning, and evidence could carry consequences far beyond a single defendant. Scopoliti's career placed him in front of some of the darkest cases in Italy's modern history. His professional experience included cases involving terrorism, organized crime, and political violence. He was connected to investigations and proceedings surrounding the Moro case. He dealt with the hijacking of the Achille Lauro. He was involved in matters connected to the murder of Rocco Chinnici. He worked on the Piazza Fontana bombing case. He also dealt with the massacre aboard the Rapido 904 train. These were not ordinary criminal cases. They belonged to a period in Italian history when violence could suddenly enter the lives of ordinary citizens and when the distinction between criminal organizations, terrorism, and political violence could become frighteningly complicated. Scopoliti spent his professional life moving through that darkness. Yet it is important not to reduce him to his job. The tragedy of a person can sometimes become distorted when history remembers only the position they held. Prosecutor, judge, investigator, victim. The titles become larger than the human being. But before he was a senior prosecutor, Scopoliti was a person. He had a life outside the courtroom. He had a connection to Calabria. He had a family. He had the routines of an ordinary man. And in the summer of 1991, he was not living like someone preparing for the final moments of his life. He was on holiday. That fact changes the way we should look at the final day. Imagine the contrast. 4 years, his professional life had been defined by files, legal arguments, and cases involving people accused of extraordinary violence. Yet during those summer days, the rhythm was different. The pressure of the courtroom temporarily gave way to the slower rhythm of Calabria. The roads he traveled were familiar. The landscape was familiar. The sea was close. And the man who had spent so much of his career dealing with danger was simply moving through his own region. There is something deeply human about that image. A prosecutor who had worked on cases that could fill newspapers was driving his BMW through Calabria like anyone else. No courtroom surrounded him. No legal document was open in front of him. No panel of judges was waiting for him. He was simply going home. But there was another part of Scopoliti's life that made his final weeks particularly significant. His professional career had brought him to the center of the fight against organized crime. And in 1991, one case stood above many others. The Maxi trial against Cosa Nostra. The case had grown out of years of investigations into the structure and activities of the Sicilian mafia. It represented a fundamental change in the way the Italian state approached organized crime. Instead of treating mafia murders, drug trafficking, extortion, and other crimes as separate events, investigators had attempted to demonstrate the existence of a wider criminal organization. The evidence accumulated. The defendants were brought before the court. The trial became historic. And after the initial proceedings, the case continued through the appeals process. Eventually, it approached the Court of Cassation. That was where Scopoliti's professional life and the larger history of Cosa Nostra came together. In May 1991, he accepted the responsibility of representing the prosecution at that final stage. The decision placed him in a position of enormous importance. He was no longer simply another prosecutor handling another file. He was preparing to stand before the highest court and defend the prosecution's position concerning convictions that could have profound consequences for the mafia. For men inside Cosa Nostra, the prospect was frightening. The organization had survived police investigations before. It had survived arrests. It had survived public accusations. But the Maxi trial represented something different. It threatened to transform what had long existed as a world of whispered names and hidden relationships into a matter formally recognized by the courts. A conviction was more than a legal punishment. It was an acknowledgement by the state that the organization existed and that its members could be held responsible for belonging to it and participating in its criminal activities. Scopoliti was therefore preparing to defend more than a collection of individual convictions. He was preparing to defend years of investigative work. He was preparing to stand at one of the final gates between the mafia and the judgment of the Italian state. And then, according to the central theory surrounding his murder, someone decided that he should not reach that courtroom. This is where the story of Antonino Scopoliti becomes especially painful. Because there is a temptation to imagine a man like him as someone who lived permanently surrounded by danger. But the available account does not show a dramatic final confrontation. It shows a man on holiday. A man traveling through Calabria. A man without a security escort. A man following a familiar route. That is what makes the assassination so unsettling. There was no grand battlefield. There was no warning that would allow Scopoliti to prepare himself. There was simply a road. The killers, according to the reconstruction described in the case material, appear to have known enough about his movements to place themselves where they could intercept him. The man who had spent decades studying criminal cases was now himself being studied. His routine could be observed. His movements could be anticipated. His professional importance could be transformed into a target. And perhaps the most disturbing aspect of that transformation is how quickly a human life can become an item in a criminal calculation. To the people who loved Antonino Scopoliti, he was not the prosecutor assigned to the Maxi trial. He was not the senior official of the Court of Cassation. He was not a strategic obstacle. He was a husband, a father, a relative, a friend, a colleague. His absence would not be measured in legal consequences. It would be felt at home. The house would still exist. The familiar objects would still be there. The memories would remain. But the person at the center of those memories would never walk through the door again. That is often the hidden tragedy behind high-profile assassinations. History remembers the reason. Families remember the person. And the two versions of the story are never quite the same. For investigators, Scopoliti's death represented a potentially organized attack on the Italian justice system. For the mafia, if the theory was correct, he may have been seen as an obstacle that needed to be removed. For his family, none of those explanations could answer the simplest question. Why him? Why did a man who had spent his life serving the law have to die on a road during a summer holiday? His professional history provides part of the answer. Scopoliti had repeatedly entered cases where the stakes were enormous. He had worked on terrorism. He had worked on organized crime. He had dealt with cases that exposed violent networks and challenged people who were willing to kill in order to protect themselves. The pattern of his career showed a man who had not chosen the easiest path. Every major case added another layer of experience. Every investigation brought him closer to the realities of criminal power. And yet he continued. That continued commitment is important because courage can easily be romanticized after someone has died. It is easy to call a person brave once the danger has already become history. But Scopoliti made his decisions while the danger was still present. When he accepted the assignment concerning the Maxi trial, the conflict between the Italian state and Cosa Nostra was not something that existed only in history books. The mafia was real. Its members were armed. Its influence was real. And prosecutors knew that the consequences of challenging it could be deadly. Scopoliti still accepted the role. That decision does not tell us exactly what he was thinking. We should not invent private thoughts that history cannot recover. But his professional actions tell us something important. He continued to perform the work expected of him. He continued toward the Court of Cassation. He continued within the system of law that he had served since the age of 24. And that makes the circumstances of his death almost unbearably ironic. The very system he had dedicated his life to defending was preparing to hear one of its most consequential mafia cases. The prosecutor assigned to help defend that case was murdered before he could complete his task. The timing would become one of the central facts investigators could not ignore. Yet Scopoliti's life should not be remembered only through the moment of his death. There were decades before the final afternoon. Decades of study. Decades of work. Decades of decisions made under the authority of the law. He moved from one Italian city to another, building the experience that eventually brought him to the country's highest court. The young man who entered the judiciary at 24 had become a senior prosecutor who had seen the legal system confront some of the most dangerous forces in Italy. His career was a long road. And on August 9, 1991, he was driving along another road. The difference was that this time he was not going toward a courtroom. He was going home. There is a cruel simplicity to that final journey. He had spent his career looking backward, reconstructing crimes after they happened, examining evidence and trying to determine responsibility. Now, without knowing it, he was becoming the subject of the very kind of investigation he had spent his life conducting. His own movements would be reconstructed. His final route would be examined. The location of his vehicle would become evidence. The injuries to his body would become clues. The people around him would be questioned. His professional enemies would be considered. His role in the Maxi trial would become a possible motive. His connections to Calabria would become part of the investigation. And years later, even the physical position of his car would be examined again. But none of that could change what mattered most. Antonino Scopoliti was gone. The prosecutor had become a victim. The man who had spent his life asking what had happened to others now had his own unanswered story. His murder would expose a terrifying possibility, that organized crime could reach beyond the people directly involved in criminal enterprises and strike at the highest levels of the justice system. And if the theory connecting his death to Cosa Nostra and the 'Ndrangheta was correct, then the assassination was even more significant. It suggested that criminal organizations separated by geography could cooperate when their interests converged. Sicily needed something. Calabria could potentially provide it. And somewhere between those two worlds stood Antonino Scopoliti. But at the center of all these theories remained a human being. A man born in Calabria. A prosecutor who entered the judiciary at 24. A professional who worked in Bergamo, Rome and Milan. A senior prosecutor who eventually reached the Court of Cassation. A man who had handled cases involving terrorism, mafia violence, and some of Italy's most notorious acts of political and criminal violence. A man who, in 1991, was preparing to take part in the final judicial battle of the Maxi trial. And a man who, during a summer afternoon, climbed into his BMW and began the journey home. Perhaps he expected to see familiar faces. Perhaps he expected an ordinary evening. Perhaps he was simply thinking about the next day. We cannot know. What we do know is that somewhere along that route, ordinary life was about to disappear. The man behind the legal title would become a victim. The prosecutor would become a case file. The case file would become a mystery. And the mystery would outlive the people who first investigated it. More than 30 years later, investigators would still return to the physical scene. Still reconstruct the vehicle's position. Still examine the circumstances of the shooting. Still consider testimony from people who claimed knowledge of the criminal networks involved. Still ask whether the decision came from Sicily, Calabria, or from an agreement between the two. But before any of those questions could be answered, there was one final ordinary afternoon. Antonino Scopoliti was alive. The summer was still around him. The road was still open. The sea was still nearby. And he was still the man who had spent his life believing that the law could reach places where fear had ruled for generations. He did not know that he was approaching the final moments of that life. He did not know that the road ahead had become an ambush. He did not know that someone had potentially studied his routine and chosen the precise moment to strike. And he could not know that his death would become one of the great unresolved stories connecting Italy's justice system to the hidden world of organized crime. The man was still driving. The prosecutor was still alive. The future, for a few more minutes, still belonged to him. Then the road curved. And everything changed. By the beginning of the summer of 1991, Italy was living through a strange contradiction. On the surface, the country was still recognizable as the Italy people imagined from postcards and television. The cafes were full. Families were preparing for the August holidays. Trains carried people south toward the coast. Children disappeared into the summer streets while older generations sat outside in the evening, watching the heat slowly leave the pavement. August was supposed to be a month of escape. Factories closed. Offices emptied. Cities became quieter as millions of Italians left for the sea or returned to the towns where their families had roots. In Calabria, the summer carried its own rhythm. The days were long and bright. The Mediterranean was never far away. The mountains and hills created roads that curved through the landscape, sometimes opening suddenly toward the sea before disappearing again behind another bend. For someone passing through the region, it could be difficult to imagine that beneath this beauty existed one of the most deeply rooted criminal organizations in Europe. But beauty and violence had learned to exist beside each other. The 'Ndrangheta was not an organization that needed to announce its presence every morning. Its power could remain almost invisible. It could exist in relationships, businesses, family networks, and favors exchanged quietly between people who understood the rules without needing them explained. That invisibility was part of its strength. A person did not necessarily have to see a mafia member to understand that the mafia was present. Sometimes it was enough to know who owned a particular business. Who could make a problem disappear? Who could make a phone call? Who could obtain something that ordinary people could not? Who should never be offended? Who should never be questioned? And, perhaps most importantly, who should never be spoken about? This culture of silence was not created overnight. For generations, criminal organizations in southern Italy had learned that fear worked most effectively when it did not have to be constantly demonstrated. A single murder could be remembered for decades. A single disappearance could teach an entire community a lesson. A single whispered warning could prevent dozens of people from speaking. That was the environment in which the Italian state was trying to fight organized crime. But the early 1990s were different from previous decades. Something had changed. For years, the mafia had been powerful because much of its internal structure remained difficult for investigators to penetrate. Criminal organizations depended on secrecy. Their members rarely spoke. Witnesses were afraid. Evidence was difficult to connect. Then investigators began to understand that the most important question was not always, who committed this murder? Sometimes the question had to be much larger. Who gave the order? Who controlled the territory? Who benefited? Who was connected to whom? And what happened when apparently separate crimes were placed beside one another? In Sicily, this way of thinking was transforming the fight against Cosa Nostra. The work of investigators and prosecutors such as Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino helped build a picture of Cosa Nostra as an organized system rather than a collection of independent criminals. That distinction was crucial. If a murder was committed by one man acting alone, the state could prosecute that man. But if murders, extortion, drug trafficking and intimidation were connected to a wider organization, then the state had to confront the organization itself. The Maxi trial represented the enormous judicial expression of that idea. The trial had become a symbol. Inside the courtroom, hundreds of defendants faced accusations connected to the activities of Cosa Nostra. Outside, the mafia watched. The outcome mattered. It mattered to prosecutors. It mattered to judges. It mattered to police officers. It mattered to families who had lost relatives to mafia violence. And it mattered to the men whose power depended upon the belief that nobody could successfully challenge them. For Cosa Nostra, The danger was not only that individual members might go to prison. The greater danger was recognition. If the court accepted the prosecution's case, then the existence and structure of Cosa Nostra would be confirmed through the authority of the state. The organization could no longer dismiss the investigations as isolated accusations. Its internal hierarchy could be exposed. Its members could be held responsible. Its power could be converted into evidence. And so the legal process became a battlefield. But it was a strange battlefield. There were no soldiers standing opposite one another. One side carried legal documents. The other side carried the knowledge that violence could be used when necessary. One side worked through procedure. The other worked through secrecy. One side waited for hearings. The other could act in seconds. By 1991, the Maxi trial was approaching the Court of Cassation. That meant the case was entering a stage where the legal arguments could have consequences for the convictions that had already been obtained. And this was precisely where Antonino Scopoliti became important. Scopoliti was not a young prosecutor trying to make a name for himself. He had already spent decades inside the justice system. He had worked in different parts of Italy. He had dealt with some of the country's most sensitive criminal cases. His professional life had brought him into contact with terrorism, political violence, and organized crime. He understood what the mafia represented. He understood the stakes. And yet he accepted the responsibility of representing the prosecution at the final stage of the Maxi trial. That decision placed him in an uncomfortable position. To the state, he was doing his job. To the mafia, according to the theory that would later dominate the investigation, his work could represent a serious threat. And that is where the landscape of Calabria becomes essential. Because Calabria was not Sicily. Cosa Nostra had its roots in Sicily. The 'Ndrangheta had its roots in Calabria. They were separate criminal organizations with their own structures, families, and territories. But criminal organizations do not always behave according to the boundaries drawn on maps. When interests overlap, enemies can become partners. A request can cross the Strait of Messina. A favor can travel from one criminal family to another. A debt can be repaid years later. And an assassination can be arranged by people who never appear at the crime scene. The possibility that something like this happened in the Scopoliti case would become one of the most important questions surrounding his death. Why Calabria? Why there? Why a Calabrian road? Why a prosecutor who was not a local political figure, a police officer, or a mafia rival? Why Antonino Scopoliti? The answers seemed to point toward his professional role. But the location suggested another layer. Someone may have needed local knowledge. Someone may have needed people capable of moving through the area without attracting attention. Someone may have needed a team willing to carry out an assassination inside Calabrian territory. If Cosa Nostra was behind the decision, then the possibility of assistance from the 'Ndrangheta would become a logical investigative direction. But logical does not mean proven. That distinction would follow the case for decades. Some of the most dramatic claims surrounding the murder would come from people who later cooperated with Italian authorities. Their testimony could be extraordinary. But testimony could also conflict. One person might remember a conversation differently from another. One collaborator might claim knowledge of an order. Another might deny it. A third might provide details that appeared convincing but could not be independently confirmed. Investigators therefore faced an impossible task. They had to separate what people claimed from what could actually be established. And organized crime made that task even harder. The people who know the truth are often the same people who have spent years learning how to hide it. A mafia organization is not a normal hierarchy. An ordinary employee can explain who gave an order. A criminal organization built on secrecy cannot operate that way. The person at the bottom may know only what he needs to know. The person delivering an order may never reveal its source. The person who ultimately benefits may never communicate directly with the person who carries out the killing. This creates layers. And every layer creates distance from the truth. In the Scopoliti case, that distance would become enormous. The man who pulled the trigger, if identified, might know the name of the person who recruited him. That person might know only the intermediary. The intermediary might know who wanted the prosecutor dead. And the person who made the original decision might remain protected behind several layers of silence. This is why the question who killed Scopoliti has always contained several different questions. Who physically fired the weapon? Who organized the ambush? Who provided the information about Scopoliti's movements? Who authorized the operation? Who benefited from it? And was there a larger agreement between criminal organizations behind the entire plan? Those questions are not interchangeable. A person can be guilty of carrying out a murder without being the person who ordered it. A boss can order a murder without ever approaching the victim. And an organization can benefit from a killing without every member knowing that it happened. That complexity was already part of the world surrounding Scopoliti. But there was another factor. The Italian state itself was changing. The fight against organized crime was becoming more aggressive. Investigators were no longer satisfied with arresting individual mafia members. They wanted the structure. They wanted the money. They wanted the hierarchy. They wanted the connections. And the more successful the investigations became, the more dangerous the conflict became. The mafia had an enormous incentive to preserve silence. The state had an enormous incentive to break it. Between those two forces stood people like Scopoliti. He represented an institution that did not depend upon personal revenge. He represented a system in which a defendant could be judged through evidence and legal procedure. For criminal organizations, that was dangerous precisely because the system could continue even after one investigator was gone. But killing a prosecutor could still create delay. It could create uncertainty. It could intimidate others. It could send a message. And if the target happened to be responsible for a critical stage of a major mafia trial, the symbolic value of the murder could be even greater. This was the atmosphere in which the summer of 1991 unfolded. The newspapers were filled with political tensions and stories of organized crime. The public knew that the mafia was powerful. But many people could still maintain a psychological distance from it. The mafia belonged to another world. A world of Palermo streets, Calabrian villages, hidden meetings, criminal families, weapons, drugs, extortion. People could read about those things in the newspaper and then close the paper and return to their ordinary lives. For Antonino Scopoliti, however, that world was not distant. It was part of his professional reality. He had spent decades reading the evidence that ordinary people saw only in headlines. He knew the names. He knew the allegations. He knew how violence could be organized. He knew how people disappeared. He knew how criminal networks could survive by making witnesses afraid. He also knew that the law had to continue operating even when the people it confronted were dangerous. That was the professional world he had chosen. And it was that world that followed him into his holiday. The irony is difficult to escape. A holiday is supposed to create distance from work. For a few weeks, the courtroom should disappear. The files should close. The telephone calls should become less urgent. The mind should turn toward family, food, the sea, and the simple rhythm of summer. But for Scopoliti, the case waiting for him in Rome did not disappear simply because he was in Calabria. The Maxi trial continued to exist. The legal arguments continued to exist. The people who feared its outcome continued to exist. And according to the central theory surrounding his murder, the threat he represented did not depend upon whether he was sitting at his desk. It followed him. That is why his decision to travel without a security escort has become such an important detail in the reconstruction of the case. He was not moving like a man expecting an assassination attempt. He was moving like someone who believed that he could still live an ordinary life. Perhaps he felt secure because he was in his own region. Perhaps the threat had not been communicated to him. Perhaps he simply did not believe that the danger had reached that level. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. On the afternoon of August 9th, Scopoliti was vulnerable. And someone may have known it. The road between Ferito and Piali was not a stage built for a dramatic crime. It was simply a road. But a road can become a weapon in the hands of someone who understands it. A bend can reduce visibility. A passing car can hide movement. A motorcycle can approach quickly and leave just as quickly. The landscape itself can become an accomplice. The killers do not need to own the road. They only need to understand it better than their victim does. That is what makes an ambush so psychologically different from a confrontation. The victim believes he is traveling through space. The attacker has already transformed that space into a trap. By the time the victim recognizes the danger, the decision has already been made. There is no negotiation. No warning. No time to ask why. The attack happens. Then the attackers disappear. And the investigators arrive afterward, trying to reconstruct a few seconds from physical evidence and incomplete testimony. That is the nightmare investigators would face after Scopoliti's death. But before that happened, there was still another invisible force moving through the background. The internal conflict within the 'Ndrangheta. Calabria's criminal organizations were not a single unified machine. Different families and clans had their own ambitions. Territories overlapped. Alliances shifted. Rivalries could become violent. And during this period, the criminal landscape was undergoing its own struggles for power. This matters because later testimony would suggest that the murder of Scopoliti may have been connected not only to Cosa Nostra's concerns about the Maxi trial, but also to interests inside Calabria. One of the theories would involve an alleged bargain. Cosa Nostra wanted something. A Calabrian faction wanted something else. A deal could potentially satisfy both. Such an arrangement, if it occurred, would explain why a Sicilian interest might result in a killing carried out in Calabria. But it also raises another question. What could Cosa Nostra offer? And what did the Calabrian clans expect in return? The answers would appear in different forms in later testimony. Some accounts suggested that the fate of Scopoliti was connected to efforts to influence the balance of power among Calabrian clans. Others pointed toward direct cooperation in the assassination. But these claims were never transformed into one uncontested narrative. The deeper investigators went, the more difficult it became to distinguish the original decision from the stories people later told about it. That is one reason this case remains so compelling. There is a clear victim. There is a clear murder. There is a powerful potential motive. There are known criminal organizations that had reasons to fear the judicial process. But between motive and proof lies a vast distance. And in that distance are decades of questions. The Italy of 1991 was approaching one of its darkest periods. Nobody standing on a Calabrian road that August afternoon could know exactly what the following year would bring. They could not know that Giovanni Falcone would soon be murdered in a massive explosion. They could not know that Paolo Borsellino would be killed in Palermo. They could not know how openly the mafia would challenge the state. They could not know that Italy would enter a period when judges, prosecutors, police officers, and civilians would become symbols in a conflict that had moved far beyond traditional organized crime. But the signs were already there. The state was pushing harder. The mafia was under greater pressure. And when criminal organizations feel that the walls are closing in, they do not always retreat. Sometimes they attack the walls. Antonino Scopoliti would become one of the people standing on those walls. His murder would therefore carry a meaning beyond the death of one man. It would become a question about whether the justice system could be intimidated. Could a prosecutor be killed and the legal process simply continue? Could a murder change the outcome of a major trial? Could organized crime reach from Sicily into Calabria and strike at a representative of the Italian state? Could two criminal organizations cooperate when their interests aligned? And could investigators ever prove who had actually ordered the killing? Those questions were still waiting. On August 9, 1991, they had not yet become history. They were only possibilities. And as the afternoon moved forward, Scopoliti remained unaware of how close he was to becoming the center of one of them. He was driving through Calabria. The road continued ahead. The summer sun hung over the landscape. The sea was nearby. Somewhere beyond the next curve, the people waiting for him were preparing to turn an ordinary journey into a crime scene. For Antonino Scopoliti, there was still a future. For the men watching the road, there was already a plan. And between those two realities was only a matter of minutes. To understand why Antonino Scopoliti could be killed on an ordinary road in Calabria, it is not enough to understand the mafia as a collection of violent men. Violence was only the visible part. Behind it was an architecture of power that had been built over decades. It was an architecture without official buildings, without uniforms, without government seals. Its offices could be a cafe, a private home, a garage, a restaurant, or a quiet room where several men sat around a table and spoke in voices low enough that nobody outside the room could hear. Its records were not necessarily written down. Its agreements were often carried through memory. Its authority did not come from a constitution. It came from reputation. And reputation was reinforced by fear. In Calabria, the 'Ndrangheta had developed around family-based criminal structures known as cosche. Blood relationships could make loyalty unusually difficult for investigators to penetrate. A person could betray a business partner. He could abandon an associate. But betraying a relative was another matter entirely. That structure gave organized crime a peculiar resilience. When one member was arrested, the entire organization did not necessarily collapse. When one man disappeared, another could step into his place. When police discovered one connection, other connections remained hidden. And when someone inside the system decided that a person had become dangerous, the order did not necessarily need to travel through a formal chain of command. It could move through relationships. A conversation here. A message there. A meeting behind closed doors. A name spoken once. Then silence. This was the world that surrounded Calabria in the years before Scopoliti's assassination. But there was something else that made the region especially important. Calabria was not isolated. Across the Strait of Messina lay Sicily. The distance between the two regions was small in geographical terms, but the criminal networks operating there had developed their own identities and structures. Sicily had Cosa Nostra. Calabria had the 'Ndrangheta. For much of their histories, they were distinct organizations. Yet criminal organizations do not necessarily remain enemies when cooperation becomes profitable. The mafia understands territory. It understands influence. It understands favors. And it understands that an enemy of your enemy can sometimes become a temporary partner. By 1991, the Italian authorities were increasingly confronted with evidence that the criminal world could operate across regional boundaries. Money could move. Weapons could move. Information could move. People could move. And, potentially, orders could move. That possibility becomes crucial when examining the murder of Scopoliti. Because his death occurred in Calabria, but the strongest suspected motive was connected to a judicial proceeding involving Cosa Nostra in Sicily. That created a geographical contradiction. Why would a prosecutor working at Italy's highest court be killed in Calabria because of a case centered on Sicilian organized crime? The answer might have been simple. Scopoliti was in Calabria because it was home. But the circumstances surrounding his death suggested something more deliberate. Someone had to know that he was there. Someone had to know his movements. Someone had to be willing to organize an armed attack. And someone had to believe that killing him was worth the risk. That is where the concept of criminal cooperation becomes important. Imagine two criminal organizations separated by territory. One organization has a problem. The other has local access. The first organization may have information, money, influence, or something else the second organization wants. The second organization has people who know the local roads, local families, local rivalries, and local dangers. A transaction can be created. Nobody needs to call it an alliance. Nobody needs to sign a document. Nobody even needs to trust the other side completely. They only need to recognize that, for one particular purpose, cooperation is more useful than conflict. That possibility would later become central to theories surrounding Scopoliti's murder. According to one of the major investigative theories, Cosa Nostra wanted the prosecutor eliminated because of his role in the final stage of the Maxi trial. If that theory was correct, then the decision to kill Scopoliti may have originated in Sicily. But the people who ultimately carried out the attack could have been Calabrian. This would explain why the murder occurred on Calabrian soil. It would also explain why investigators eventually looked closely at powerful Ndrangheta families. But there is an important distinction. A theory can explain the circumstances of a crime without proving them. And the Scopoliti investigation would become a long struggle between those two things. There were compelling motives. There were statements from people claiming knowledge of the criminal world. There were suspected figures. There were judicial proceedings. But the chain connecting all of those pieces was never simple. Some testimony conflicted. Some accounts changed over time. Some claims could not be independently confirmed. And some people who were accused or investigated were never ultimately convicted for the murder. That is why the case cannot honestly be reduced to a sentence such as the mafia killed Scopoliti. The mafia connection is at the heart of the investigation, but the exact legal truth is much more complicated. And perhaps that complexity tells us something about the nature of organized crime itself. The more sophisticated a criminal organization becomes, the less likely it is that the person who benefits from a crime will be the person who commits it. The distance is intentional. Distance protects the people at the top. A boss does not need to stand on a roadside with a shotgun. He does not need to know every detail. He does not need to speak directly to the killer. The fewer people who know the entire plan, the safer the organization becomes. This is why investigators often have to reconstruct a crime backward. They begin with the body, then the weapon, then the movements, then the possible witnesses, then the relationships, then the motive. And finally, they try to climb the invisible ladder toward whoever made the decision. But every step upward becomes harder. The person at the bottom may be dead. The intermediary may refuse to speak. The person who gave the order may deny ever knowing the victim. And the people who actually know the truth may have every reason to keep it buried. In Calabria, silence could be more than fear. It could be a social mechanism. People knew that speaking about certain matters could bring consequences. They understood that criminal organizations had long memories. They knew that a person could be watched without realizing it. And they knew that the safest answer to certain questions was sometimes no answer at all. For investigators trying to solve the murder of a senior prosecutor, this created a terrible paradox. The more important the information became, the less likely people were to speak freely about it. The crime scene could tell investigators how Scopoliti died. It could not easily tell them who ordered his death. The vehicle could show where the attack occurred. It could not identify the person who had planned it. The shotgun could provide forensic evidence. It could not explain the political and criminal calculation behind the shooting. Those answers required human testimony. And human testimony was exactly what organized crime had learned to control. That was the environment in which the investigation unfolded. But there was another layer to the story. The early 1990s were not simply a period of mafia power. They were also a period when the state was becoming more determined to confront it. The Maxi trial had demonstrated what could happen when investigators, prosecutors, and judges worked together to expose the internal structure of Cosa Nostra. For the first time, the Italian public could see the organization not merely as a collection of frightening stories, but as a criminal system capable of being placed before a court. That achievement had psychological importance. For ordinary citizens, it offered the possibility that the state could actually fight back. For mafia members, it represented danger. And for prosecutors such as Scopoliti, it represented responsibility. The law had moved into territory where violence had previously been the dominant language. But the mafia had its own response. When legal pressure increased, the organization could increase the pressure of its own. The years surrounding Scopoliti's death would prove this. The violence against representatives of the state would escalate. The deaths of judges and prosecutors would demonstrate that the conflict was no longer hidden. The mafia was capable of attacking symbols. And a senior prosecutor at the Court of Cassation was an extremely powerful symbol. The symbolism of Scopoliti's position cannot be overstated. He represented the point where years of police work and prosecution could eventually become a final judicial decision. Imagine the amount of effort contained inside a major mafia case. Investigators spend years collecting evidence. Witnesses take enormous risks. Families wait for justice. Prosecutors prepare arguments. Judges examine evidence. Courts issue decisions. Appeals follow. The process can take years. But eventually, the case reaches its final stages. At that point, one legal argument can determine whether years of work survive. Scopoliti was preparing to participate in that stage. That made his professional role potentially dangerous. And if the allegations surrounding the motive were correct, his murder was not simply intended to kill a man. It was intended to remove a legal obstacle. There is something particularly cold about that concept. A human being reduced to a problem. A prosecutor reduced to a role. A life reduced to a calculation. He was not necessarily hated because of something personal. He was dangerous because of what he was going to do. That is how organized crime can look at its enemies. Not as complete human beings, but as obstacles. The distinction matters because it changes the psychology of the crime. An impulsive killer may act because of anger. An organized criminal group can act because of strategy. The decision may be discussed calmly. The target may be selected. The location may be studied. The timing may be considered. The people involved may be chosen. And then the violence occurs. The emotional temperature of the planners may be completely different from the emotional temperature of the victim. For Scopoliti, the afternoon of August 9th was personal. For the people who allegedly ordered his death, it may have been strategic. That contrast is one of the most disturbing elements of the case. The victim was living a human life. The perpetrators, if the central theory is correct, were solving a problem. And the solution was murder. The possibility of cooperation between Cosa Nostra and the 'Ndrangheta adds another dimension. These organizations had their own internal rivalries and interests. They were not a single mafia. They had different territories, different structures, different leaders. Yet a common threat can temporarily unite people who otherwise compete. The Italian state could be that common threat. The courts could be that common threat. A prosecutor could become a shared enemy. And the Maxi trial could become a point where separate criminal interests suddenly overlapped. For Cosa Nostra, the immediate concern was the survival of its convictions. For certain Calabrian groups, there may have been their own calculations involving alliances, rivalries, and the struggle for power. If a bargain existed, it would not necessarily have been about Scopoliti alone. His death could have been one element in a much larger exchange. This is where later testimony became so important. Collaborators of justice would eventually describe alleged conversations, meetings, and agreements. Some would claim knowledge of how the assassination had been organized. Others would connect it to figures from powerful Calabrian families. One account even suggested that Scopoliti had been approached with an offer of money connected to the Maxi trial and that he had refused. But such claims must be treated carefully. A statement made by a collaborator is evidence to be examined, not automatically the final truth. Collaborators may tell investigators things they genuinely know. They may also misunderstand events. They may exaggerate their importance. They may protect themselves. They may settle old rivalries. They may mix personal knowledge with rumors. Investigators therefore have to ask the same question repeatedly. What can be independently verified? In the Scopoliti case, that question would prove extremely difficult. Years would pass. People would change their stories. Some witnesses would die. Some suspects would be acquitted. Some investigations would be reopened. And the case would refuse to disappear. But before the investigation could become complicated, there was still the simple physical reality of August 9, 1991. The road. The BMW. The motorcycle. The shotgun. The ambush. The body of a prosecutor. Everything that came afterward would begin with those few seconds. The investigators who arrived at the scene could not see the larger history. They could not see Cosa Nostra's internal calculations. They could not see the future. They could not see the courtroom battles that would follow. They could only see what was left behind. And that is how criminal investigations usually begin. Not with the answer. With fragments. A damaged vehicle. A body. A weapon. A road. A witness who remembers something. Another witness who remembers something different. A name. A rumor. A connection. A possible motive. And somewhere in the distance, an invisible person who may have made the decision. The investigators would have to build the story backward. Who was Scopoliti? Where had he been? Where was he going? What route did he normally take? Who knew his routine? Who knew that he was in Calabria? Who could have followed him? Who had a reason to want him dead? Who had the resources to arrange it? And why was the timing so close to the final stage of the Maxi trial? Each question opened another door. Behind one door was Sicily. Behind another was Calabria. Behind another was the Italian justice system. And behind all of them was the same possibility. Someone had decided that Antonino Scopoliti should not reach the courtroom. The irony was that the more investigators tried to understand the murder, the larger it became. It was no longer only a homicide. It was potentially a message. It was potentially an act of strategic interference. It was potentially evidence of cooperation between criminal organizations. And it was potentially the beginning of a new phase in the war between the Italian state and the mafia. The timing would soon become even more significant. Scopoliti's death occurred in August 1991. Within less than a year, Italy would experience the assassination of Giovanni Falcone. Then Paolo Borsellino. The violence would become so extreme that the country itself would be forced to confront the scale of the threat. Looking backward, Scopoliti's murder can seem like an early warning. A warning that the mafia was prepared to attack the legal system directly. A warning that prosecutors were not simply professionals doing paperwork. They were targets. And a warning that the battle over the Maxi trial was about much more than one group of defendants. It was about whether the state could force organized crime to accept the authority of the law. Scopoliti's death therefore occupies a strange place in Italian history. He was not the first prosecutor to be killed. He was not the last. But his murder came at a critical moment. The old Italy was beginning to disappear. The political landscape was changing. The criminal landscape was changing. The relationship between the state and organized crime was changing. And the mafia was preparing for a confrontation unlike anything Italy had experienced before. In that changing landscape, one man became a target. Antonino Scopoliti. A prosecutor. A Calabrian. A senior representative of the Italian justice system. A man who was supposed to stand before the Court of Cassation. A man who, instead, would never reach the courtroom. And that is where the setting of this story finally narrows. The enormous world of Italian organized crime becomes a single road. The complicated relationship between Sicily and Calabria becomes one afternoon. The struggle between the state and the mafia becomes one man inside one car. The legal battle over the Maxi trial becomes a question of survival. And the invisible architecture of criminal power becomes visible in the only way it sometimes can be. Through violence. On August 9th, the summer heat was still hanging over Calabria. The road stretched ahead. Scopoliti was driving. He could not see the ambush. He could not see the future. He could not know that decades later investigators would return to the same location and attempt once again to reconstruct what happened. He could not know that his name would remain attached to one of Italy's most enduring unsolved mafia mysteries. For him, it was still simply another afternoon. For the men waiting on the road, it was something else entirely. It was the moment when preparation would become action. And as Scopoliti approached the bend, the invisible war between the mafia and the Italian state was about to become brutally visible. By August 1991, Antonino Scopoliti had learned something that many people who work in the justice system eventually discover: danger does not always announce itself. It does not always arrive with a threatening telephone call. It does not always come in the form of a stranger standing outside a house. Sometimes danger looks exactly like an ordinary afternoon. The sun is still shining. The road is still open. Other cars are still moving. And the person who is being watched has no reason to believe that anything has changed. That was the world surrounding Scopoliti during his final days in Calabria. He had returned to the region of his birth for his summer holiday. Born in Campo Calabro in 1935, he had spent much of his professional life away from the landscape where his story had begun. His career had carried him through Rome and Milan and eventually to the Supreme Court, where he served as a substitute prosecutor general. But Calabria remained different. Here, he was not simply a senior magistrate of the Italian Republic. He was Antonino. He was home. And that distinction matters. Because home is where people tend to lower their guard. It is where familiar roads become routine. Where the same bends are taken without thought. Where a person knows roughly how long it will take to reach the house. Where the landscape becomes so familiar that the brain stops registering every detail. For someone planning an ambush, however, routine can become information. A repeated route can become a timetable. A predictable departure can become an opportunity. And a familiar road can become a carefully selected killing ground. Scopoliti was described as methodical in his movements. Later accounts would emphasize that he followed familiar routes and routines while staying in Calabria. That detail is important because an assassination of this kind depends upon anticipation. The attackers do not simply need to find their victim. They need to find him at the right moment. They need to know where he will be. They need to know when he will be vulnerable. And they need to know enough about the surroundings to disappear afterward. On August 9, 1991, Scopoliti had spent the day at the seaside. It was the kind of summer day that, viewed from the outside, seemed completely ordinary. The sea. The heat. The long afternoon. The slow transition toward evening. At some point, he began the journey back. He was alone in his car. There was no security escort accompanying him. There was nothing about his journey that suggested he was entering a situation in which his life was seconds away from ending. The Fondazione Scopoliti records that he was returning after a day at the sea when he was intercepted by his attackers in the Piali area. The location itself is significant. Piali is a fraction of Villa San Giovanni, in the province of Reggio Calabria. The roads in this part of Calabria do not have the anonymous quality of a massive urban highway. They pass through a landscape in which hills, buildings, roads, and open spaces are tightly connected. A person who knows the area can understand the rhythm of traffic. He can know where a driver must slow down. He can know where a bend restricts visibility. He can know where a vehicle has fewer options. And that is precisely what makes an ambush so different from an ordinary shooting. The victim does not choose the moment of confrontation. The attackers do. They choose the terrain. They choose the timing. They choose the distance. And they decide when the attack begins. The road ahead of Scopoliti was not simply a route home. To the people waiting for him, it had become a place where a decision could be executed. According to the established reconstruction, at least 2 attackers were involved and were traveling on a motorcycle. They were armed with 12-gauge firearms loaded with buckshot. Scopoliti was struck by 2 shots to the head fired in rapid succession. The violence was immediate. There was no prolonged struggle. No opportunity for the victim to escape. No courtroom. No legal argument. No appeal. A man who had spent his career working through the slow machinery of justice was confronted by a form of violence that required no patience at all. The entire attack could be over in seconds. And that contrast is perhaps one of the most powerful ways to understand the world in which Scopoliti lived. The justice system moves slowly because it is supposed to. Evidence must be examined. Witnesses must be questioned. Arguments must be presented. Defendants must be given rights. Judges must deliberate. The process can take years. Criminal organizations operate differently. They do not need to prove anything to anyone. They do not need to explain their decisions. They do not need to wait for a verdict. If they decide that someone has become an obstacle, they can attempt to remove the obstacle immediately. That was the collision taking place beneath the surface of Scopoliti's life. The Italian Republic had spent years building a case against Cosa Nostra. Scopoliti was preparing to represent the prosecution before the Court of Cassation in the final stage of the Maxi trial. The defense would challenge convictions. The prosecution would argue that those convictions should stand. And somewhere in the criminal world, the outcome was being watched with enormous interest. The stakes were not theoretical. The Maxi trial had produced hundreds of convictions and represented one of the most significant judicial attacks ever mounted against Cosa Nostra. For the men at the top of the organization, the possibility that those convictions could survive the final appeal was a serious threat. Scopoliti's role was therefore not merely administrative. He was preparing to defend the prosecution's position. According to the Italian Ministry of the Interior, he was preparing to seek rejection of the appeals filed by leading mafia figures convicted in the first Maxi trial. This is where the motive begins to emerge. But it is also where caution becomes essential. A motive is not the same thing as proof. The fact that someone could benefit from a murder does not automatically identify the killer. The fact that an organization had something to fear does not establish that every member of that organization participated in the assassination. And the fact that later collaborators described an alleged agreement does not mean every detail of those accounts is necessarily true. The Scopoliti case has remained complicated precisely because of this distance between suspicion, testimony, and definitive judicial proof. Two major trials were later held in Reggio Calabria concerning mafia leaders and the alleged responsibility for the killing, but the murder did not produce a final judicial reconstruction accepted as the complete truth. That unresolved quality gives the story a particular darkness. The victim is known. The date is known. The location is known. The method is known. But the full chain of responsibility remains disputed. Who decided that Scopoliti had to die? Who organized the operation? Who provided the information? Who physically carried it out? And, perhaps most importantly, what exactly was promised in exchange? Those questions would take investigators deep into the relationship between Cosa Nostra and the 'Ndrangheta. The theory was that the murder was not simply a Sicilian operation transported into Calabria. It may have involved cooperation. That possibility is what makes the geography so important. If Scopoliti had been killed in Palermo, the location would have been easier to interpret. But he was killed in Calabria. His own Calabria. The territory of another powerful criminal organization. That suggested that the people behind the attack may have relied upon local knowledge and local criminal networks. Later testimony would attempt to describe such connections. One of the alleged explanations involved a bargain connected to the internal mafia conflict in Reggio Calabria. Another line of testimony pointed toward requests made by Cosa Nostra to Calabrian clans. But these accounts were not perfectly consistent, and later proceedings did not establish a universally accepted chain of responsibility. That uncertainty should remain part of the story. It is tempting in true crime storytelling to take a complicated collection of testimony and turn it into one clean narrative. Real investigations are rarely that clean. People remember differently. People lie. People exaggerate. People protect themselves. People tell partial truths. And sometimes people who know something important do not understand the entire picture themselves. Organized crime makes this even harder. A person can know that a meeting happened without knowing what was decided. A person can know that a killing was planned without knowing who ordered it. A person can know who carried out an attack without knowing why. And someone at the top can create a decision that travels downward through several layers without ever meeting the person who eventually pulls the trigger. That is why the road where Scopoliti died became more than a crime scene. It became the beginning of a journey backward. Investigators would have to travel from the physical evidence toward the people. From the people toward relationships. From relationships toward motives. And from motives toward whoever had the power to turn an idea into a death sentence. But before the investigators began that journey, there was the moment itself. The car. The road. The motorcycle. The gun. The curve. The attack. And then the silence afterward. The first interpretation was not necessarily that a senior prosecutor had been deliberately assassinated. The violence was so sudden that the car left the road and ended up in a terrapieno, or embankment. One historical account notes that the vehicle initially created the appearance of a road accident before the gunshot wounds revealed the truth. That detail is chilling because it illustrates how quickly the scene could be misunderstood. A damaged car. A vehicle off the road. A dead driver. At first glance, an accident. Then investigators look closer. They examine the body. They discover the wounds. And suddenly the entire scene changes. The road accident becomes an assassination. The victim becomes a target. And the investigation moves from traffic reconstruction to organized crime. The difference is enormous. An accident asks what happened to the vehicle. A murder asks who wanted the person inside it dead. That single change transforms every detail. The road becomes evidence. The victim's routine becomes evidence. His professional responsibilities become evidence. His contacts become evidence. His upcoming court appearance becomes evidence. His connections to Calabria become evidence. And the possibility of mafia involvement becomes impossible to ignore. Scopoliti's death was therefore not simply shocking because he was a prosecutor. It was shocking because of when it happened. He was due to appear before the Court of Cassation in January 1992 in connection with the Maxi trial. Historical records from the Calabrian Institute for the History of Anti-Fascism and Contemporary Italy identify him as the prosecutor designated to represent the public prosecution at that hearing. The timing created an obvious question. Was the murder intended to interfere with the legal process? The theory was that removing Scopoliti could delay the proceedings and potentially create consequences for defendants facing long periods of detention. That theory has been repeatedly cited in accounts of the murder, but it should be presented as the investigative and historical explanation rather than as a simple fact proven beyond every dispute. And there was something else. Scopoliti was not an anonymous official. He had spent decades building a reputation inside the Italian judiciary. He had worked on cases involving terrorism and organized crime. His professional history included the Moro case, the Achille Lauro hijacking, the Piazza Fontana bombing and the Rapido 904 massacre. These cases placed him repeatedly in the middle of Italy's most difficult judicial battles. He understood violence. He understood evidence. He understood the machinery of criminal organizations. And yet, on that August afternoon, none of that professional knowledge could protect him. He was not sitting behind a courtroom bench. He was not surrounded by colleagues. He was not reading a file. He was simply driving home. That is perhaps the most human part of the entire story. The man who had spent his life dealing with extraordinary events was still allowed to have ordinary moments. A day at the sea. A drive home. A familiar road. The expectation of reaching his house. That is what was stolen from him. Not simply his professional future. His ordinary future. The evenings that would never happen. The conversations that would never take place. The cases he would never finish. The courtroom he would never enter. The pages he would never read. The arguments he would never make. and the people waiting for him who would instead receive the news that he was dead. This is why it is important to resist turning Scopoliti into nothing more than a symbol. He was a symbol to the state. He may have been a target to organized crime. He became an icon to the anti-mafia movement. But before all of those things, he was a human being. A human being who had spent decades serving the law. A human being who returned to his homeland for summer. A human being who was alone in a car. And a human being whose life ended on a road in Piali. After the shooting, the landscape that had been ordinary only moments earlier became a crime scene. The car stood damaged. The body was inside. The evidence had to be collected. The investigators had to determine what had happened. The possibility of an organized assassination quickly became clear. But the killers were gone. The motorcycle was gone. And the people who knew the truth were somewhere beyond the immediate scene. This is the point where the story changes direction. The setting has been established. The world of Calabria has been introduced. The relationship between Cosa Nostra and the 'Ndrangheta has become a central question. The Maxi trial has provided a possible motive. Scopoliti's career has established why he could have become a target. And the road has become the place where all of these forces collided. But the murder itself is only the beginning. Because once the gunfire stopped, the real battle began. It would be a battle fought not with weapons, but with evidence. Investigators would have to reconstruct the ambush. They would have to identify the motorcycle. They would have to determine how the attackers knew where Scopoliti would be. They would have to examine his final movements. They would have to trace his professional enemies. They would have to listen to people inside the criminal world. And eventually, they would have to decide which stories could be believed. The road could tell them how the attack happened. It could not tell them who ordered it. For that, they would need people. And people were where the case would become most complicated. Because in the world surrounding the murder of Antonino Scopoliti, the truth was not lying openly beside the road. It was buried beneath layers of fear, loyalty, betrayal, money, and silence. And somewhere beneath all of those layers was the answer to the question that would haunt the investigation for decades. Who wanted Antonino Scopoliti dead badly enough to turn a summer journey home into an execution? On August 9, 1991, the answer had already been put into motion. But investigators were only beginning to see its outline. And the first clue was lying in the wreckage of a car at the edge of a Calabrian road.